All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone's having a wonderful Friday. And I thank you all for being here today to join us for this exciting webinar. I'm going to check and see the chat and the participants, see who we've got trickling in. And I'm going to take a second because I see we're slowly having folks join. First thing I'm going to do for everyone is remind everyone that this is being recorded. Additionally, I'm going to get the live transcript up, the closed captioning. And so at this point, folks should start to see the closed captioning at the bottom of the screen. If anyone has any issue and is not seeing that at the bottom of the screen, please feel free to reach out to me in the chat. All right, we have about 20 folks that are here. And I know that we had 70 folks that were registered, so I know we're waiting on some folks to get ready. But again, thank you for joining us on this Friday, taking time out of your schedule to learn about the rapidly evolving digital age and how nonprofits are affected and can best maximize this new evolution. We have a wonderful speaker here today, and I'm going to turn it over. Oh, well, actually, before I turn it over, excuse me, we're going to be collecting questions and answers in the chat and the question and answer box. I'll be looking at that and making sure that any question that you have does get posed throughout our time learning here today. So please feel free to drop those questions into the chat or the Q&A. Additionally, this training opportunity was approved for CLE credit. So I am going to be dropping that CLE information into the chat at the end. Additionally, we will follow up with this recording, the CLE number, and materials that our speaker has graciously agreed to share after we're done here today. So I think I covered all my bases. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Jeffrey for further introductions.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. Today's webinar is being put on by the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar, and specifically the Nonprofit Legal Work Group. We try to do a couple of webinars each year, and we appreciate everyone joining. We have a great speaker, Jeremy Coffey, who I'm going to introduce in a minute. I just want to give a plug for the Public Interest Law section, though. As you saw, if you're a lawyer in Florida, we encourage you to join. It's only $35. There's a lot of different, public interest is a broad topic. And so we have a lot of subject matter work groups. We have children's rights, civil rights, consumer protection, disability, homelessness, immigration, nonprofit law, that's who's sponsoring today's, as well as parents advocacy. And so if you practice in any area that touches on one of those matters, I really encourage you to join the section. We have monthly work group meetings, we have networking events, we have an annual meeting, and you get to connect with like-minded lawyers that are practicing in the same space. So thanks for your consideration of that. And then moving on, I'm going to introduce our speaker today, a member of our section, Jeremy Coffey. Jeremy is an attorney focused on supporting the impact sector. He represents nonprofits, individuals, and socially conscious for-profits who are working to improve the world around them. His practice includes issues of governance, corporate structure, and innovative fundraising strategies. He's licensed to practice in both New York and Florida, and we're really lucky to have him here today presenting on virtual currency, DOAs, and I'm sorry, see that shows my lack of knowledge already. So I'm going to DAOs and other crypto type currencies. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you, Alexis. And thank you to everybody who is joining us here today in the middle of a Friday, if you're joining us live, and to anyone else who's joining later on the recorded version, thank you also for listening in. Jeff kind of already ran through my bio, but I have it up here anyway. I just wanted to give a little bit more background and my experience with the topics that we're discussing today. I started working in this general area in 2015 when the law firm I was at the time, we represented a large company in the virtual currency space, working through regulatory issues at the state and federal level, and have been involved ever since, including working with platforms, folks who issue virtual currencies, DAOs, which we'll get into the definition of what those exactly are and what that acronym stands for. And then my most common work in this area has been with nonprofits, considering how to get involved. Up until recently, it was primarily focused on whether or how to accept donations of virtual currency, but in the last 12 to 18 months, that conversation has really expanded in a lot of ways to consider how nonprofits can or should get involved in issues relating to the topics that we're going to discuss, the kind of innovative virtual topics that have been in the news and that have affected the business community, and is not going to just fly by the nonprofit community without affecting them either. So with that, I just wanted to give you a quick outline of what I wanted to discuss today. First, I just want to touch on some kind of definitional questions of what the heck is Web3, that is in the title of the webinar, and also has been in the news a lot, and the kind of definition that I will be using during the course of today's presentation. And then I'm going to kind of go through what I envision is the evolution of Web3 to date, which I would say that it largely started with the advent of blockchain technology and virtual currency. It's evolving in front of our eyes as we're seeing, NFTs proliferate, and then the DAOs, decentralization, is kind of furthering that evolution. And then I think the frontier, the unknown of which way the Web3 is going to really evolve is what we may call the metaverse, which is a kind of generic term for a lot of different things, but basically the idea that there's going to be a virtual landscape in which a lot of us will, or some of us are already working, playing, learning in, and how nonprofits are being included in those spaces and might include themselves in those spaces in the future. So with that, here we go. So a quick discussion of kind of the evolution of the web and the way in which it's referred to when we're talking about Web3, which you may have seen a lot in the news. Web 1 is kind of referred to the early days of the internet, kind of pre-2001 or 2004 or so, around there. And it was basically where users of the internet had a largely passive experience. They would, to the extent that they could shop, they might have shopped, they might have been able to read news articles, but largely users were not generating content. Web 2 is kind of the increasingly interactive nature of the web, and I think the advent of social media platforms in a much more significant way than they had been prior to those dates. And so this is where users are contributing their content to the internet in a much more active and proactive way, but it's still largely being funneled through large platforms, and all of that activity is also being monetized almost exclusively by those platforms or other corporate players within that ecosystem, but the monetization is not being enjoyed by any of the users, whether they be individuals or nonprofits or corporate users of the internet. It's largely being run through these sort of funnels of the platforms. And then Web3, at least as I understand it, and I understand that there may be some folks who have a slightly different definition, but Web3 is largely referring to the kind of the decentralization of those activities and the ability of users to all of a sudden become much more in control of the content that they put on the web and the utilization and monetization of that content. And so, we're going to talk about that and how it kind of, in my mind at least, started with virtual currency and the blockchain, and then is continuing to evolve. I think most folks who use the Web3 term acknowledge that we're kind of right at the beginning of it, and it's really hard to understand exactly where it's going to go. And so that's why it's kind of hard to define, at least from my perspective. But that's kind of the working definition that I'm using. I do want to mention that for a lot of the topics that we'll discuss today, I will have citations kind of at the bottom of where I'm pulling some of the stuff that's contributing to how I'm thinking about these topics. And then, as Alexis mentioned at the outset, I have a lot of these materials in PDF form that I will try to compile so that they can be shared with you after the webinar is done. So the first topic that I wanted to touch on and discuss how nonprofits have interacted with it is virtual currency and the blockchain. It's kind of hard not to have heard about virtual currency and the blockchain at this point. Most of us have somebody in our lives, a relative, a coworker who likes to talk about the market for virtual currency, the use of blockchains, and it's still relatively hard to get a really concise definition. But for our purposes, virtual currency began in around 2008 when there was a white paper published by someone who we still don't have confirmation as to their identity. It could have been an individual or a group of individuals, but basically this person or people put together an outline for Bitcoin, essentially, and how a decentralized currency could be created and maintained on the blockchain. The blockchain itself is, at least in the Bitcoin context, is basically a decentralized ledger or database that runs on a number of different nodes. These are, for instance, miners on the Bitcoin blockchain. And it makes the function of the blockchain is to basically verify transactions. And so one of the features of blockchain technologies generally, and there are variations, but generally speaking, is that they're very hard to kind of retroactively hack or alter. They're almost only able to change moving forward, and it's kind of a static record going back. And then in addition, they are very hard to hack because of the way in which they verify transactions, which requires a lot of agreement amongst all of these different nodes that are running on the network. So if one were to hack the blockchain, one would have to hack all, a majority at least, of these nodes that are running the blockchain. And so it has made it largely very difficult to hack. Now, you may have read about a number of hacks, and those are typically related to people who are holding virtual currency on the blockchain. And so a lot of, not a lot, but some of those hacks you might see referred to in the news are hacks of individuals' accounts or holdings at different institutions that work on the blockchain, but not necessarily a blockchain hack itself. Now, one of the things that I think is a bit of a misnomer for the industry, and that gets brought up a lot by my nonprofit clients when I talk to them, is that this is we have no idea how this is going to be treated, especially from a tax perspective in the United States. And there are certainly some uncertainties, and it's certainly a much more uncertain area of the law than, for instance, publicly traded stocks and securities. However, our government agencies, especially at the federal level, have been dealing with these issues for quite some time. I put a couple notices and guidance on the screen there, one from FinCEN that basically talked early on in around 2013 about how some businesses and organizations involved in the virtual currency ecosystem would be considered money service businesses under the Bank Secrecy Act. And says at the federal level, a number of states have come up with similar determinations. We're going to talk about Florida in just a minute. And then IRS has pretty consistently since 2014 decided that virtual currency is going to be treated as property. And so there has actually, at least to my mind, been some certainty from a tax perspective as to how to treat virtual currency transactions. There are certainly some questions around the margins, around valuation, et cetera. But I think by and large, we do have that guidance. One of the issues that IRS has been trying to deal with, especially recently, has been to get users to report their income from virtual currency transactions. The infrastructure bill that passed last year included some new provisions requiring additional parties within the virtual currency ecosystem to begin reporting on what transactions occur and linking those to the customers within their ambit. And so, there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of activity within the virtual currency community from people who are mining it, all the way up to like major platforms, trying to figure out whether or not they're going to be affected by this law. But by and large, what IRS is trying to do is trying to make sure that it is capturing transactions in virtual currency that have heretofore kind of gone unreported, or at least that's the concern on IRS's part. And from a nonprofit's perspective, as I mentioned earlier, they have to accept these donations as if they are any other kind of donation of real or personal property that doesn't fall within another exception, right? So publicly traded securities, while they are property, don't involve as many issues around valuation and reporting as others do because they're publicly traded. We have a lot of information about valuation and timing, et cetera. Whereas for a virtual currency donation, if the donation exceeds, for instance, $5,000, there's a particular form that has to be filed first by the donor, and then later when the nonprofit sells or liquidates the virtual currency, they have a follow-up form. And there's, I think, a variation within the industry of how many people are actually doing that. And also there's a variation. A lot of nonprofits have been accepting small dollar donations in virtual currency, but that is another example of IRS's attempt to try and get its arms around how the industry is working. I do want to just point out that there are a lot of other agencies, especially at the federal level, that are keeping an eye on virtual currency and the evolution of decentralized finance generally, but they're not quite as germane to our discussion today. So for instance, the Securities and Exchange Commission has been thinking about how to regulate virtual currencies, and who within the virtual currency ecosystem counts as an issuer of securities, and what types of tokens might count as securities. And that has been a consideration. And so there are instances, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit later, where nonprofits that might come into play when they're considering whether to accept something or who to work with within this space. But by and large, the SEC's considerations are kind of outside of nonprofits' concerns. And similarly with the CFTC, they have also been thinking about virtual currency, and there are certain products within the virtual currency space that might be regulated by the CFTC and certain companies, but by and large, nonprofits kind of fall outside of that ambit. And recently, President Biden issued an executive order asking the federal agencies to kind of coordinate in their assessment of how on earth they're going to come up with a comprehensive regulation plan for virtual currency companies and the decentralized finance environment generally. And so that is kind of a start, a much more concrete start to having a much more coherent set of regulations over the industry. And I was surprised to see that a lot of participants within the virtual currency community seemed to be actually relatively receptive to that executive order, because I think while a lot of them are nervous as to what regulations might emerge, I think they are more nervous about the uncertainty that's inherent in the environment now. So that's something to keep an eye on as well, but has not yet borne any fruit. So for Florida, and there's a case cited in the footnotes there, but when I first started looking at this sector, I checked Florida as one of the many states that was relevant to one of my clients at the time. And at the time, this would have been 2015 or 2016, the Office of Financial Regulation basically said, when referring to its money transmission regulatory scheme, virtual currency is not money, it's not currency, it's property, it's something else. So therefore, it's going to fall outside of our sort of money service licensing regime. And that changed in 2021 in a case where, following a long investigation of an individual who was using Bitcoin, I believe in particular, but virtual currencies generally, to help folks potentially launder money, the Office of Financial Regulation basically did a 180 and said, we are going to start applying our money service business licensing scheme to virtual currency folks who are selling virtual currency. And therefore, anyone who is in Florida now who is doing that activity now has to be cognizant of Florida's rules. And this same type of sort of money services business licensing scheme, each state, typically almost each state, has its own regime. So to the extent that you're counseling anybody who is looking to work with a platform based in New York or California or Nevada, etc., it behooves you to try and see what that state's stance on whether or not that particular type of virtual currency business or decentralized finance business requires registration, because failure to do so can generate a ton of penalties. It could undermine the ability of the organization to continue operating as a going concern. And so you would want to be really careful about entering into any relationship that in which your client is substantially relying on them, where you're uncertain or unsure about their registration status in the particular states in which they're operating. And then I just wanted to go through really quickly a lot of the concerns and kind of discuss them when nonprofits are considering working with virtual currency and blockchain companies or accepting donations, etc. The first big bucket of concerns that I hear is that this whole area is too uncertain. We don't want to get involved in anything where we don't know what's going to happen. And I addressed this earlier with when we discussed the IRS, but generally speaking, I would say that a lot of that uncertainty has kind of been ironed out, especially as it comes to accepting donations, right? Especially now, there are a number of platforms, we'll discuss one in just a minute, that will facilitate the acceptance and liquidation of virtual currency that's almost instantaneous. And so nonprofits do not have to deal with, the fluctuation in values that is kind of inherent in the virtual currency market. So I think that a lot of those concerns, at least in my opinion, are addressable if you, especially, when typically this comes under the ambit of a nonprofit board's finance committee or investment committee in determining whether or not to accept these. And so I think, understanding their concerns, and then trying to address them, most organizations can get comfortable with at least accepting virtual currency. There's a whole different question as to whether or not to hold it as an investment under, a nonprofit's investment policy. Another concern that's not unfounded is where the assets, where the particular tokens or virtual currency is coming from. I think that the virtual currency community as a whole has kind of been plagued by its worst actors and ideas that somebody who is a black hat or somebody who is trying to blackmail or otherwise do something illegal will use virtual currency, and that's what this new technology is used for. And so folks are concerned about accepting donations where they don't have 100% visibility into where the money came from. And while I certainly think that we've seen in the news a number of stories of folks demanding, for instance, locking out people from their computers and demanding Bitcoin as payment because, at least in theory, it's easier for them to then liquidate or something else. I think by and large this concern kind of is addressable. Put it that way. When you think about other types of donations that we accept, cash, you have no idea where the cash came from before it came from the individual who handed over. Also, we have recent history in New York, at least, of nonprofits receiving substantial amounts of anonymous cash donations. There was a university in the city that recently just got a brown bag full of $100 bills. They made a reasonable effort to figure out exactly where it came from, to make sure that they weren't knowingly engaged in any kind of illicit activity or money laundering. But having done that due diligence, they found, no, why not? Why wouldn't you accept it? And cash is actually far more anonymous than virtual currency, for the reason being, the blockchain which we talked about earlier, which is kind of the distributed database, while you can be pseudonymous on it, you don't have to use your real name largely, unless you're going through one of the major platforms, but it is highly transparent in the sense that every transaction in Bitcoin, for instance, is logged on that on the blockchain. And so we've seen recently, especially with a few high-profile bad actors within the space, that U.S. authorities in particular have been able to track down who was responsible for certain thefts of virtual currency, as well as receiving certain ransoms paid in Bitcoin, and been able to claw back a substantial portion of those payments. And so I think that kind of underscores the idea that there is actually something that you can do to figure out where this Bitcoin came from. And there are a number of services now that have popped up to try and help track and uncover where Bitcoin has been coming from and is going to. So I think that again is an addressable concern. The record keeping and compliance, we talked about that earlier with regards to especially IRS. There are a few things that you just need to put in place that you might not otherwise if you're a nonprofit looking to get into this space. But again, I think that's by and large, we have enough certainty and understanding of the regulatory environment that's addressable. Internal policies and procedures that I've listed here, this is basically, this is your gift acceptance policy and your investment policy, which I consider a best practice with any nonprofit of any size, is to have a policy describing, okay, what types of gifts will I accept? A lot of nonprofits are not capable of accepting real property. They don't want to have closely held stock. And so then you have to decide, well, where does Bitcoin or virtual currency fall within our list of things that we're willing to accept? I think with the service providers out there now, this should probably, a virtual currency can probably be as easy to accept as, a credit card payment, but that's up for each board and organization to determine. And then the procedures, what happens when you accept it, what due diligence are you required to do in advance of a major gift in virtual currency? That should all be thought through and laid out ex ante by the board, to give clarity to your development folks and your IT folks who are trying to implement these strategies. And then legal compliance by partners, I think, is always an interesting concern. You always, like I mentioned earlier, want to make sure that the people who you're working with are properly registered or licensed in whichever jurisdiction in which they're operating. And because you obviously don't want to, even if the nonprofit might not have legal liability, if they work with someone who did not have a license, you might still have reputational risk by working with someone who, if it turns out that they were operating illegally and you were their major customer, in the news articles that come out say they were supporting nonprofit ABC, that's not good. So we always want to do a little bit of due diligence into our partners who we're working with. And then this last concern is energy consumption. Blockchain, and particularly Bitcoin and Ethereum blockchains, have been in the news in the last 18 months or so because of the vast amounts of energy that a lot of the people mining those currencies consume. Ethereum is working on trying to shift to a new model. I won't get into the details, but basically a new model that would vastly reduce the amount of energy that's consumed. And that's important because the Ethereum blockchain is used for what we're going to talk about later with NFTs and a lot of smart contracting. Bitcoin, to my knowledge, is not, the community is not considering any kind of shift, but it's becoming much more common for miners and folks within the nonprofit community who are working to accept Bitcoin to consider how they can manage that energy consumption, whether it's buying offsets, trying to only work with folks who are trying to be carbon neutral or are using renewable energy. There are a lot of different ways to go about doing it. And then also it's just helpful for folks to be wary of, if they do decide to accept virtual currency, this is a common area of pushback from donors and supporters who might be upset if the nonprofit is, on the one hand, touting its environmentally friendly practices, and on the other hand, accepting Bitcoin. You want to be able to think through what's a coherent response to that critique, even if it is a valid critique. And then I just wanted to give you some background in terms of the kind of scale that we're dealing with. Pew says that around 16% of Americans have invested in, traded, or used virtual currencies. And last year, as I think every year has been since around 2015, since I've been paying attention, last year was the record in terms of donations received by nonprofits. The Giving Block is one of the major donation processing companies, and they put out a report and basically said that there was a 1,000% increase in people donating virtual currencies. They've increased the donations of stable coins. Stable coins are these types of tokens that in many ways look and feel like virtual currency, but they are pegged to a particular fiat, currency. So like the dollar, so that that if you buy $1,000 worth of the Tether US coin, then that will be worth $1,000 in a week or a month. There's still a lot of uncertainty around how those products are going to be regulated, but right now they are a very, very stable place to put your sort of virtual currency funds. And the average size of donation for the clients working with the Giving Block was around $10,000, which is not insubstantial. So that was kind of virtual currency in a big nutshell, and from very, very general terms. I wanted to move on because I think that this next topic is kind of the next evolution of the web and the virtual currency space as it applies to nonprofits, and that's NFTs. NFT stands for a non-fungible token, and they really kind of broke into mainstream consciousness last year with the sale in March of an artist named Beeple. His pseudonym is, or his art's nom de plume is Beeple, and he published what was called the first 5,000 days, which, if I remember correctly, was basically just, it was one large artwork, but was comprised of the 5,000 days in which he had been publishing each day a piece of art to the web, and he sold that for around 69 million. Caveat to the whole NFT space is that I think because it's so unregulated, and we've read a lot about how a lot of the prices may be a little inflated because folks will sometimes do what I think is called in the financial sector wash trading. Basically they will be on both sides of the transaction. They'll create a new account to bump up the value of their NFT or their artwork, and then hopefully that catches onto the attention of other investors, and then suddenly it's off to the races. I don't think there's any necessarily, I don't have any reason to doubt that Beeple's sale was not arm's length into a third party, but generally speaking, the market is flush with folks who attempt to kind of raise artificially the value of the asset that they're trying to list. And an NFT, I should probably have said this sooner, it's most generally associated with artwork, digital artwork in particular, but it is, and the NFT itself is basically just a proof of ownership, a certificate of authenticity that is connected to the blockchain, so that you can trace an asset's ownership back to its origination. So somebody who knows what they're doing can say, okay, which asset are you trying to trace back? They can find it on the blockchain, and they can basically work backwards to see, okay, it was owned here, it was sold for this much, it was owned by this person, and it was sold for this much, and this is how it arrived at your wallet that you have. In theory, the application of NFTs has been floated for all sorts of other types of assets, real property, where the deed is basically linked back to the blockchain, so that anybody can go and figure out, okay, who holds the deed to first 123 First Street, and it will be hard to fake, and it would be reliable, and it would be much more frictionless than currently going to try and find a deed might be. That is still, I think, a long way from being mass produced or available to everyone, but it's certainly one of the many proofs of concept that is working its way through. It is this particular sector, and especially with regards to artwork, has become extremely popular amongst a number of major brands who are Adidas, for instance, and I think Nike are coming up with virtual NFTs of different varieties. And then there are lots of nonprofits who have been working in this space to benefit from sales of NFTs. So some stats on the left here. They exploded in value and popularity last year, and you can see the numbers there. And again, referring back to Giving Block's report, they estimate that around $12.3 million worth of NFT related proceeds were donated to nonprofits. And so I wanted to give you a quick use case here, which is the Miami Hurricanes launched not just an NFT, but an entire platform for trading NFTs that related back to some of their illustrious history of different types of wins. And so they would put up an NFT, for instance, of a championship ring, and you could be the person who would own that particular copy of that particular digital version of a championship ring. And so they put their toe in the water last year to try and explore whether or not that would be a way of generating revenue. One of the things that you will also see in the NFT community, especially around digital art, is that it is largely kind of a community mechanism. It's a way of engaging folks around a particular idea or topic and generating interest and bringing folks together. There are Discord channels where folks will just discuss different NFT projects. And so this example, for instance, with the Hurricanes is kind of that. They're trying to leverage an existing community and trying to continue to bring people together to enjoy past successes, and own a piece of this piece of collective memory that the fan base already has. And so you've seen a lot of folks trying to do the similar things of kind of building an online digital community around sports teams and artwork and organizations that I think is really interesting, and in many ways mirrors what we've seen with folks who are comic book fans and who might collect certain editions. This is not that dissimilar. It's just in the digital context. Some of the concerns that I have seen raised around NFTs, and I should say that towards the end of last year, I had a number of clients who were considering, who had been approached by donors who said, I would really like to donate my NFT that's worth $100,000 to you. And we had to work through, okay, well, what does that even look like? First we have to figure out, okay, let's make sure, how do we verify that this person's NFT is genuine in some way? One of the issues that kind of plagues the NFT community is understanding, well, if you can trace back to when a particular piece of artwork or another item was uploaded to the blockchain, but how do you confirm that the person who uploaded that particular item to the blockchain had the right to do so? Did they own, the copyright? Were they the creator originally? In the news recently, I think it was, Quentin Tarantino, who was trying to upload something that was related to one of his movies, and the production studio with which he'd been working said, hold on a second, while you were involved in that, we own the rights to XYZ script, or I forget exactly what the asset was that he was trying to upload. you have no right to do that. And so therefore, anyone who had purchased that would, in theory, be, have trouble determining what the value of that was, or whether they even had the right to own it or resell it. So that was the first kind of lens we had to look through, is, okay, let's see how we can confirm that this asset that somebody wants to donate is really theirs to donate, and whether or not that value is something that we can feel comfortable with. And then there's the mechanism of actually accepting it. Does the nonprofit need to have a wallet on a particular blockchain? Is there any way to display it? If you're representing a museum that wants to actually curate and hold the art, how are you going to do so in a safe way without putting the art at risk of being hacked or anything else? Or if you're going to sell it immediately, how does that look? So tons of questions. There's there are jurisdictional questions as well, depending on where the artwork originated. The mechanism for transferring copyright might be different. And then as with any donation of any type of property and artwork, if it's valued, or if the donor is hoping to claim a value of a certain threshold, they might need a valuation. And so you're going to have to go out and find someone who can value NFT artwork or whatever else the asset is that's linked to the NFT. So there's a whole host of questions for nonprofits in this space to try to figure out exactly how they can sort of take advantage of the vast increase in value around the NFT marketplace. And then it's something I did want to flag as well, that we discussed with potential donors who were considering how best to get the value that they created or enjoyed through their NFT's appreciation over to the nonprofit, is that you have to be careful how many different taxable events you have in the transfer. IRS takes the position that any first of all, if you were to sell the NFT and then donate the proceeds, you would have a taxable event with that sale. Secondarily, if you have to convert virtual currency from one currency to another, that's a taxable event that you would have to consider. And so we just want our donors to be very, very careful and cognizant of the different ways in which they are transferring their virtual assets, whether it's cryptocurrency or NFTs, etc., to ensure that they minimize their tax exposure in the course of doing so. Let me just check myself for time. Wonderful. So now we're moving on to what I would call, full decentralization. Even with our virtual currency and with our NFTs, those are largely going through different portals, right? So NFTs are going through marketplaces that funnel value through them. Virtual currency tends to go through platforms that verifies the user's identity and so forth. And while not required in either sense, you can for both NFTs and for virtual currency, you can avoid those gatekeepers. That's largely the way in which those communities have evolved. With DAOs, this is an attempt to basically remove gatekeepers from the corporate structure altogether. DAO stands for a decentralized autonomous organization. I think that that's a bit of a misnomer, and we'll talk about why. But basically, it's a novel corporate in quotes structure that's intended to minimize any kind of overhead and administration. It's kind of a libertarian corporation. It again leverages blockchain technology and smart contracts and attempts to automate certain corporate functions. So I've listed a few examples, but basically the way that it works is an organization, a DAO, will try and attract supporters into its ecosystem and say, would you like to be a member of the DAO? You can be a member by, and there's typically a mechanism, right? Holding on to X number of tokens will make you a member. And then they will then ascribe voting rights to such membership. So maybe if you hold 1 token, you get 1 vote. If you hold 1,000 tokens, you get 1,000 votes. And then basically what they will do is they will create a smart contract that lives on the blockchain that is unique to that particular organization. And it will say, okay, anybody who, let's say we're a grant making organization. We have $1 million in our treasury. So anybody who is a member and holds tokens can propose a grantee. And therefore, once that, assuming that grantee has been proposed in the right way, such that it triggers an automatic vote of the membership, if a majority of members vote in favor or a majority of votes outstanding vote in favor, that grant will just be issued. There's no need for any other corporate overhead. There's no need for any other management to get involved. That the grant will just be sent out to the designated grantee. And so that's generally the way that these are kind of in their most ideal form structured to work, so that there's no need for a board. There's no need for a chief executive officer. There's just, there's typically a team that is involved at the outset to try and work out all the kinks of how our members determined, how our vote's going to happen, how are we going to measure membership, and so forth. There are a lot of different thoughts around whether one token, one vote disproportionately favors the wealthiest members of the community who can buy more tokens. So maybe it should be one vote based on how many wallets are on the are within that ecosystem. So that's typically a proxy for individuals. Well, that they could theoretically, one person could hold multiple wallets. And so there are a lot of folks trying to solve for how to make these more democratized, more egalitarian, such that one of the things that they are trying to solve for is the idea that corporate structures have kind of gotten out of touch with the individual shareholders, or nonprofits have gotten out of touch with their donors, and so they're trying to bring the folks who are putting their money in and excited about the mission closer to the outcome that they're looking to solve for. So closer to the grants being issued to clean up the ocean, or clean up the air, etc. From my perspective, that all sounds wonderful, but there is a whole lot of uncertainty with where the rubber hits the road. By lacking a corporate form, typically when folks come to me and ask about putting a project, for instance, into a nonprofit entity or becoming a fiscally sponsored organization, they ask for the pros and cons. And the biggest pro of putting something into a corporate entity is your liability shield, right? You're protecting yourself and the other people who are volunteering or who are working as directors and officers. You're protecting them from legal liability should everything from a slip and fall to accusations of fraud or who knows what, right? With a DAO, it's not clear, at least for most DAOs right now, that there is any such protection for any of the members who are involved. For instance, where I'm sitting in New York, if it was organized as a nonprofit, the DAO would likely be deemed an unincorporated association, which does provide some limitation on liability for the members. If they were formed as a for-profit, they would probably be treated as a general partnership, where every member bears some responsibility and potential liability for the organization's activities. In Florida, it's similar. I've put a few quotes in here, but the basic takeaway that I got from trying to dig through case law on this point was that any association like this that is organized for a social purpose, I think is the word, the terminology used in the law, which may or may not apply based on the type of DAO that you're talking about, may enjoy some of the protections that a typical legal entity would. However, that would be potentially stripped away if they are organized for profit making or what a court deems to be a profit making enterprise. And so I think that there's a ton of uncertainty. There are a couple jurisdictions. I know Wyoming is one where they have where the state has created basically a DAO LLC form, which protects the members and the participants from legal liability in the same way that an LLC might. However, if the whole appeal of this entity to your membership is that you're getting rid of this corporate form, I think those are two things that are in conflict with one another. Either you're protecting the members and the directors and the officers from liability, or you have a pure DAO where there is no such corporate shield in between the members and the organization. So it's a very difficult problem to solve for. I think one of the strategies that a lot of folks within this community have used is to have kind of multiple entities. So you might have a pure DAO that is just there to help make grants, for instance, and then you might have a traditional 501c3 corporation sitting to the side that can help fund the DAO and ensure that all of the DAO's assets are used for charitable purposes, but which provides some assurance to, for instance, any contracting partners who want to be able to sign a contract with an actual legal entity as opposed to this amorphous thing called a DAO, as well as provide some assurance to the directors and officers and any employees and any other staff who are helping maintain the DAO that they have some modicum of legal protection. One of the first problems that when I first started advising a DAO is they said, well, who would enter into a contract with us? Who from our DAO would sign? And that was a great question that I don't think anybody had an answer to at the time, because as a pure DAO, they did not have any, a bank wants to see that you're authorized to sign on behalf of the organization. there's not a lot that you can show. Maybe the members could have a vote and approve certain people to sign on behalf of the organization. Would a bank accept that? Maybe, but it's a lot trickier than if you have a sort of parallel structure that can help sit along with your DAO to solve some of these problems. Oh, and in the nonprofit context in particular, let's stop here. In the nonprofit context in particular, a lot of folks who might want to contribute to the DAO into its treasury to facilitate its donations out, they also want to get tax deductibility. And so, I've seen a debate amongst nonprofit lawyers around whether or not, if the appropriate safeguards were put in place, whether you would need a corporate structure to be able to have a tax deductible contribution to a DAO if there was no corporate structure in place. It's possible, but it would likely only take effect once the DAO had actually issued the grant, and therefore you would have to have a lot of confidence that the folks in the DAO are actually going to make an appropriate grant on the back end. And again, so that's another incentive in the direction of trying to come up with maybe a dual structure or some other kind of hybrid structure between a pure DAO and some kind of 501c3 corporation, such that you can preserve the tax deductibility and make it much clearer and cleaner for donors. And then the last topic, and I think that this is kind of forward-looking, is kind of the metaverse, which is as I mentioned at the beginning, it's kind of the next step in our Web3 evolution, and it's a change in how we're supposedly going to interact with one another in a digital space. I think that it's not so much forward-looking in certain arenas. So, for instance, video gaming, I think, has largely entered into the metaverse. There are lots of games in which you will interact with your fellow game players virtually. You'll live in a virtual world. You can buy clothes, etc. And NFTs have actually been applied to some of this space. But then the folks who are behind this technology are trying to then pivot into other spaces. So, for instance, you can go out and buy virtual real estate in one of these lands, a Decentraland, which is a platform that's powered on the Ethereum blockchain. And leverages, you can get NFTs and also a whole host of the things that we've talked about. And so this is kind of a new virtual world that folks are creating from scratch at this point. Some of them are more popular than others, especially in the video gaming space. There are a lot of people already existing and coexisting in these spaces. And so I think that they provide a number of opportunities for nonprofits. For instance, there have been concerts held in the metaverse, different venues, different types of metaverses. I was listening to a podcast yesterday with Steve Aoki, who is a DJ who has his own sort of metaverse that he's curating himself, and NFTs and a whole community that he has curated. So, there's no reason why nonprofits shouldn't be a part of this, for throwing a gala, for instance, where you could attract visitors from all over the world. You're no longer restricted to trying to find a physical space into which to hold it. You can create that space yourself. You can invite talent from anywhere around the world, and they can perform from their living rooms. You can have guests who can be anywhere in the world and participate from their living rooms. So that opens up an entirely new sort of base of potential participants and donors and supporters and partners than exists currently. The thing that I think, another area in which nonprofits, instead of just getting involved to kind of capitalize on the metaverse, is I also think that nonprofits are in a unique position in which to try and shape the way the metaverse evolves. A lot of the worst things that have plagued, especially the video gaming community, but the online community generally, whether it's harassment of different sorts, sexism, racism, etc., those are all being kind of dealt with in an ad hoc way by the various platforms, by the various companies. And I think nonprofits are uniquely situated to try and help guide these communities and help guide the folks who are building these communities, because they have a legitimacy that they can lend to this ecosystem. They have experience dealing with these issues. There are a lot of nonprofits who have been thinking about anti-Semitism, who have been thinking about sexism, who have been thinking about racism for, literally centuries. And they can bring some of that expertise to bear in terms of how the people who are designing Decentraland, for instance, can be thoughtful around, what are the community standards? How can we best solve for if somebody is alleged to have done something wrong in a way that both continues to maintain, the community feel that the developers are going for, but that also ensures that we're not going to kind of just be replicating some of the worst things from the real world that we've already experienced, or the worst things from the digital world that we've already experienced in this new arena. And so I think that there's a tremendous opportunity for existing nonprofits to kind of partner with the folks who are developing those standards and developing those worlds to help guide them or partner with them as they create what the standards will be in those spaces, to try and avoid some of the the worst excesses that we've seen of those spaces. So that is, and I'm just checking my watch. Got 10 minutes left for questions. So that was kind of the nub of what I wanted to present to you. And I see we have potentially some
Yeah,
questions.
there's some conversation that came in through the chat. First and foremost, I wanted to say, Jeremy, thank you so much for breaking this down for folks that are maybe just not as familiar with this space, and making and motivating folks to say, we can get our nonprofit involved. It is okay. There's a way to do this, safely and, within the bounds of what we feel comfortable with in the law. So that was wonderful, and I really appreciate you. I know that we had someone named Peter Bradshaw who presented some interesting conversation, and the time when you were talking about artwork. And what Peter said is, I just want to note that when it comes to NFTs and artwork, it's the same conversation of whether you own the real Mona Lisa or just the print of it. And later on in Peter's message, Peter mentions the blockchain validates the real branding. So I don't know if that opens up some more conversation for you on that topic, but Peter, thank you so much for getting involved and giving us something to think about.
Yeah, Peter, I really appreciate that. I think you're absolutely right that it's not a novel problem to the NFT space, right? Knowing whether or not you have, as you mentioned, the sort of real Mona Lisa or a knockoff. I think the trap that I know my clients fell into was thinking that if it had been uploaded to the blockchain, that had somehow been validated. And my only point was that you have to know that the person who uploaded a particular piece of work to the blockchain had the right to do so, and had the right to then whatever it is they're planning on doing, whether it's portraying that particular asset online or selling it or transferring it. You have to know that they had those rights ex ante. Otherwise, you may be acquiring an asset that is only going to be taken down. So I think you're absolutely correct in that. And then I also noted the point that you made about some of these particular use cases, and one of them was for ticketing for an event, for instance. And there have been a lot of proposals around whether you can use NFTs in a way that unlike some virtual currency that can kind of be fractionalized and broken down into tiny little pieces. Maybe you sell an NFT that cannot be fractionalized, and therefore whoever holds this NFT can get into an event. I've seen people float them as fundraising mechanisms for hospitals or universities. And so if you own an NFT sold by Beth Israel up here in New York City, you'll be able to go in and get healthcare for free as long as you own that NFT. Now, I don't think this goes to help democratize healthcare in any way, but it's a novel idea of maybe this is kind of be a ticket, an access point, and it would be more easily validated if you said, okay, it has to be on XYZ blockchain. We'll be able to confirm when you show up that you have it. So absolutely, that's one of the most oft discussed use cases for NFTs.
Awesome. And we have a few minutes, so I think we can buy some time if folks want to add some more into the chat. I do see Peter.
I'll read this one. I can address this one too. Yeah, this
All
is
right.
another great point here that I didn't get to, but we have actually seen this from the nonprofit perspective, which is Peter's point was that there is a mechanism on certain platforms and with certain smart contracts such that, for instance, an artist who sells a painting on one of these platforms can set it so that they receive 10% of any resales of that piece of artwork later on down the chain. And we've worked with clients where we've developed a smart contract that the artist might receive a 2.5% royalty on any resales, and then the nonprofit that they're partnering with might receive another 2.5% of any subsequent resales. And so they, the sale might, in the original instance, all proceeds might be going to support ABC charity, and then any resales, at 2.5% or that's adjustable, might go to support the nonprofit as well. So yeah, that's another really useful attribute of those. One of the issues that we've been trying to solve for is whether or not, if somebody were to, for instance, remove a piece of artwork from a particular blockchain and try and transfer it over, or remove it from a particular platform and try to transfer it to a different platform, if, as everything is currently structured, sometimes those royalties get lost in that removal and replacement. And so we're trying to figure out, if there's ways to either restrict those resales or solve for that problem. But yes, absolutely another benefit.
Awesome. Well, I know another question that we did get in the chat is, great presentation. When can we get a copy of this PowerPoint? Jeremy?
Yes, absolutely. I will be compiling all of my materials to give to Alexis, and then the PowerPoint as well. I'm happy for you to enjoy and read through.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you sharing all of those resources with our legal aid community. I'm going to drop the CLE number into the chat. It's 5850. Again, that's 5850. And I am happy to say that this was approved for one general CLE and one technology CLE. So if anyone is looking to get their technology credit in, as we always are, this will qualify. Since we don't have any more questions in the chat, I leave it up to you if you'd like to close out the presentation. I again thank you so much, Jeremy, for your time.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody who attended. Thank you to all of you who put in questions and comments. I really appreciate your participation, and thank you to everybody who tuned in, both for the live recording and anyone who watches this at a later date. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. All right, well, and Jeffrey, I don't know if you wanted to say anything as well. It looks like I have more participants raising their hand at the end here. I think it might have been a mistake. Let me see. Anyone else have any more questions before we close out? All right. I'm going to take that as a no. All right. We'll be following up with all the materials. Jeremy, thank you again so much for your time. I hope that everybody has a fantastic Friday, and we'll see you at the next training opportunity.
Thank you.